Well, good evening. Good to see everybody tonight. Well, we took somebody to the airport today to fly to Texas, and then somebody from Texas comes back. So it's great to see John and Sharon with us tonight. It's good to have you folks back, have you with us tonight. It's amazing how many times you can read the scripture and okie doke, thank you. How many times you can read the scripture and then see something that you've never seen before. I really appreciate Emmett's thoughts tonight. And in the text that we're going to be looking at in a minute, there may be also just some things that you may or may not have noted before in reading a pretty familiar passage. In just a moment, we're going to be in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, as we continue our study of the gospel. The first half of Mark's gospel, we've kind of heard this every week, continues to raise the question, who is Jesus? As people listen to his authoritative teaching, as they see his miraculous power, they can't help but say, who is this man? Who can speak like this? Who can do these kinds of things? Some people are moving toward faith. Some people have found themselves already in conflict with Jesus because his teachings may be in opposition to their traditions, or he may seem to them to be a threat to their power with the people. We come now to a section that finishes off this, as I think John's called it kind of the first act of the gospel. And it's a kind of a subsection in the first half of Mark's gospel where Jesus, for the most part, leaves Galilee. It's kind of a withdrawal of Jesus from Galilee. And we'll find, they'll be on the edges of Galilee, but Jesus will travel to the wilderness. He'll go into the regions of Tyre and Sidon. He will visit the Decapolis, or the cities of the Greeks, and also Caesarea Philippi. This section essentially begins with a text from last week, chapter 6, verse 14, where we kind of have this section inserted, kind of to bring us up to date on John the Baptist, where Herod is considering who Jesus might be, and we have this flashback to the imprisonment and the death of John the Baptist, and it sort of begins there, and then it ends at chapter 8, verse 30. It's somewhat of the climax of the first half of the book, certainly, where Peter in Caesarea Philippi area confesses that Jesus is the Christ. And as the section gets underway, you'll notice how verse 30 just picks up immediately from verse 13. Let's take a look at Mark 6:13. The apostles have gone out to preach, and it says they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed. Skip to verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. So essentially, we're just picking up the story from that point. That's where we left off last week, finishing up this section John did on the death of John the Baptist. And we come to a very, very familiar story in the Gospels, the feeding of the multitude. In this case, the 5,000 on the shores of the lake. I've kind of come to the conclusion in studying this passage over the last week or so that this is a really important text in the Gospel of Mark, and that Mark wants us to know that it's a very important text. And as we've talked about before, when a narrator wants you to know that something's important, he doesn't say, oh, by the way, pay attention to this next section because it's really one of the most important things I'm going to tell you. He draws attention to it in a variety of ways. And I'm certainly not saying this is the most important miracle in the Gospel of Mark, but it does have, I think, a very important place in it, and a very important role to play. And you can tell that, and as we work through it, I think it'll become even clearer. But for one thing, there's kind of a lengthier introduction to this miracle than you have in the other Gospels. And then, I think we're probably most of us familiar with the feeding of the 5,000. There's this dialogue between Jesus and the apostles leading up to the miracle. In Mark's Gospel, this section is about twice as long as it is in Matthew and Luke and John. So it draws attention to this dialogue and something that Jesus is trying to get across to the apostles. Something also that's quite unusual for a miracle is Mark will mention this miracle 2 more times after it's already occurred. Can you think of any other, I can't think of any other miracle in the Gospel of Mark where a couple of times later in the book, Mark points back to the miracle. But the feeding of the 5,000 gets referenced 2 other times. One of them we'll see tonight. The other thing is that there's a sequel to the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, which also tends to add importance to this particular story. There are a lot of other little things. One of the things that starts happening in this chapter and goes for the next few chapters is the repetition of the word bread and loaf. To kind of gets your attention that Mark is kind of pointing to this. But as we go through the text tonight, hopefully some of that will be clear. And John and I have been really kind of flying through the Gospel of Mark, and we're not going to change our overall pace. But tonight, I might spend a little bit longer on this particular text than we might normally spend on a single text, just because I think it definitely warrants that. So let's read the introduction, essentially, to the miracle. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all of the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Well, as we start this, right at the opening, where have the apostles been? What have they been doing just prior to this moment where we pick up the story? Yes, they've gone out 2 by 2. They've gone out preaching through some of the towns and villages around in the area of Galilee. And they've been sent out. Here they're called apostles because the word means sent out. Jesus had sent them out 2 by 2, and they're referred to by that name here in the text. And as they come together, essentially to make, at the first to make some kind of a report, what does Jesus suggest they do and why? What does he suggest that they do? Yes?
Rest by themselves.
Yes, so go and rest by themselves. And he even indicates the kind of place he wants them to go, a desolate place, that they might find rest. And why does Jesus point them in this direction and then obviously do this very thing? What's going on? They need a break? Okay. What's happening in the immediate scene as the apostles come to Jesus, something then happens that seems to precipitate this need for the break and to get away. Yeah, they're becoming well-known and popular. We see that a crowd gathers, and what's interesting is that it would appear, if you read through this again, it appears that who's being recognized are the apostles. Certainly Jesus is being recognized. That goes without saying. But when it talks about they saw them, they followed them, think of what the apostles have just done. The apostles have just scattered through Galilee. They've gone from town to town and village to village. They're preaching the message of the kingdom. They're performing miracles. They have authority over demons. And now they are recognizable. And as the people see them coming together, it appears that they recognize the apostles. Of course, certainly they would recognize Jesus as well. But it's almost as if the apostles themselves are bringing together this large group of people and pursuing them. And Mark then repeats in the ESV the term desolate place. You might have the word wilderness. In fact, I'm reading out of the ESV, but the same word earlier in the Gospel of Mark, the same Greek word is translated wilderness. Sometimes it's translated desolate. Sometimes it's translated desert. Sometimes it's wilderness. It's the same word, the desolate place or wilderness. Mark mentions it In verse 31, that Jesus says, let's go to a desolate place. Verse 32, they go to a desolate place. Verse 35, they say, hey, this is a desolate place. That's a pretty strange repetition. I think that's supposed to catch our attention. Mark isn't concerned so much that we know the exact geographical location of the apostles and Jesus, but he's very concerned that we understand that they're in the wilderness. This is a key motif that's mentioned beginning in chapter 1. Wilderness comes up 3 or 4 times in chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark. And so it's not an accidental word. And one of the ways that a narrator gets our attention to focus on something and to recognize its importance is to repeat it. And to have that term repeated 3, it's like, okay, we already know, don't we? We knew the first time he said it where they were, but we're told 3 times that they have gone to this desolate place. And then we're told that they are going to the wilderness that they might find rest. Now just think about that phrase for a minute. Going into the wilderness, and in the wilderness finding rest. If you think back through the Old Testament, you'll recognize that this is a theme that is repeated over and over again in the Old Testament. God giving his people rest, or promising them rest in the wilderness. Multiple times in the book of Deuteronomy, multiple times in the book of Joshua, in the Psalms it's mentioned. Isaiah and Jeremiah kind of mention it as a future hope that God will provide rest in the wilderness for his people. And so you have this theme of finding rest in the wilderness repeated over and over again in the Old Testament. And as you just stop and think about that for just a moment, notice who it is who is essentially unfolding this to happen. It's Jesus who calls them to go to the wilderness that they might find rest. In the very action of doing that, the people that the apostles have taught follow them, so that we now have, if we're thinking in large terms and going back to the way these terms are often used in the Old Testament, we're essentially having a grouping of Israel in the wilderness that they might find rest, and that they might find rest at the hands of Jesus. It seems to me that that's introducing something kind of important about what's going on here, that there's some connection here between the first Exodus perhaps and essentially a second Exodus that Jesus is coming to bring about. As these people come together in the wilderness, it is to find grace and blessing from the Messiah who is essentially leading them out there. I wonder, I don't think this crowd comes together without Jesus' understanding that this is exactly what's going to happen when he sends his disciples out into these villages. I would think this would be something he would anticipate. And it certainly does unfold. Jesus says that they are like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. You might have a Bible reference there, a cross reference. Can you think of any time that phrase, sheep without a shepherd, has been used, for example, in the Old Testament? There are a couple of times. One is in Numbers 27 and one is in Ezekiel 34 verse 5. And in both texts, the setting is the wilderness. So we begin to see, as you begin to kind of sort of connect these things, you can see something's going on here. This isn't coincidence. In Numbers 27:17, Moses prays to the Lord that he will raise up a prophet in Moses' own place in the wilderness so that the people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Who does God raise up to take Moses' place? Joshua. In the Greek version of the Old Testament, how was Joshua's name rendered? I believe it's Jesus. Jesus. Joshua, in the Greek, Jesus is the shepherd over Israel who will come after Moses. In Exodus chapter 34 and verse 5, this is a pronouncement against the shepherds or the leaders of Israel. God says that Israel has no shepherd, but he promises the coming of a faithful shepherd. Chapter 34, verse 23, he says that faithful shepherd is my servant David, who will establish a covenant of peace so that the people can live safely in the wilderness. Chapter 34, verse 25. When we start to put these things together, wilderness, rest, shepherd, Moses in Numbers 17, God speaking about his servant David becoming a shepherd over Israel, providing them rest in the wilderness, we begin to see that Mark is describing something that reaches all the way back through the Old Covenant, and that certainly this isn't coincidental or accidental to the story. And he does this to the point that in chapter 6 here, verse 34, where Jesus makes the statement of seeing the people like sheep without a shepherd, he is essentially indicated to be the one who will lead his people in the wilderness. He is God's servant David. He is the shepherd who provides for the people in the wilderness. And all of these theological themes, as I said, they're not incidental to the story, but they provide the indispensable background for understanding what's happening in this story. As I'm thinking about that and thinking about all of these Old Testament references, one thing that comes to my mind, I don't know what you think about this, is it may be that if you're a Gentile living in Rome and reading this for the first time and have no background whatsoever in the Old Testament, these connections are not going to be clear to you. This is something that would not be clear to a Gentile hearing the gospel for the first time, but it would become clear to a Gentile as they further studied the story of Israel, and it would certainly be something that would connect to any non-Gentile or even Gentiles such as ourselves who are studied in the Old Testament to make these kinds of connections. So let's go on. Any thoughts, questions, comments, or anything just about that? There's just all of these things coming together in this text that we may not really think about much or have made the connections between wilderness and shepherds and rest, and how this is the hope of Israel and this is the promise of God. In other words, what Jesus is about to do is very large on the scheme of the activity of God with his people throughout time. That this is some kind of a fulfillment. This is something that relates very much to the promises of God and the activity of God in the Old Testament. Okay, let's go on and read. Verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Why did the disciples, at the beginning of that, right there at verse 35, why did the disciples come to Jesus? What are they picking up on? And what do they want to talk to Jesus about here?
Send people away so they could go get some food. We can't, there's no way we can feed these people.
Yeah, we can feed these people. There's a lot of them. They need to send them into the villages so that they can get something to eat. And it may be that the apostles, if some of these are people that they have preached to, that they have met in these villages and they're out there, they may really they sense a personal responsibility for them, or at least some level of responsibility to say, hey, there's a need here. We need to make sure that these people can get something to eat. The day's late. There's nothing here to give them. And of course, that seems like a rather warranted conclusion given the size of the crowd that we find out at the end, at least. However, sending this many people into nearby villages may not provide a solution either. I don't know how do you have that much food in a little village nearby to feed such a group. And so what does Jesus tell them to do, and how do they respond to that? Yeah, he says, you feed them. And you remember last week as John was talking about the calling of the 12 and the sending out of the 12, he kind of introduced this whole theme about the delegation of ministry. And that's essentially what's happening here. Jesus is calling for his apostles not to be observers, but participants. And he places the responsibility for feeding the people upon them. And let me ask you, how do they respond to that? And as you read the text, what kind of tone do you pick up on in the apostles' response? It's a little bit subjective, but just as you read it, what's their comeback? When Jesus says you give them something to eat, what's their initial comeback? And also what's how do you read their tone? Okay, John hears sarcasm. That's a pretty rough thing to throw at Jesus, isn't it? Sarcasm? Think about that for just a minute. Go ahead, John.
It's presumptuous.
Okay. Okay, presumptuous. All right. Deanne? Disbelief. Yes, Tim?
Well, they don't have 200 denarii, not even close.
Sure.
They have just a few. So it's kind of a rhetorical. Like, what are we supposed to?
Yeah.
Where does this happen?
Yeah, they don't have the money. It's not like they actually have 200 denarii. That's a lot of money. I mean, it's not quite a year's wage, but it's a whole lot of money. I doubt if they're carrying that much cash on them. But even they're saying that basically even that much wouldn't be enough. John?
A lot of times in the Gospels, Jesus will say something like this, and their reaction makes me wonder how he said it. We say it in a way that was, it's hard to even put into words, because a lot of times they take him so seriously, and then they react as if he's almost like a child, not a child. It's almost like they just can't they actually think he's not aware of his issue. You know what I mean? Where he says something and they're like, come back down to earth, Jesus, don't you see the reality here? And I wonder if, I don't know, if he presented himself or asked these questions in such a way that made him seem, I don't know, oof.
Yeah, kind of disconnected from reality. I think that's a great way of, that's really a great way of seeing it. And it goes along with even the sarcasm and the other things. It fits. It's like, you got to be kidding. This, yeah, like you're saying, you realize how many people there are here, right? You realize there's absolutely no way we're going to be able to do this. And there's a little bit, I mean, depending how you want to, what you want to call that, it's just a bit disrespectful on a certain, I mean, to be sarcastic to Jesus as a disciple would be a sign of disrespect. And to even like claim, well, come on, like you say, you know, get your feet back on the ground here, buddy. This isn't happening. We don't have the resources for something like this. And it's really an interesting response. And kind of hang on to that for just a minute. Jesus responds by not letting this go, but by forcing them to take stock, of course, of the resources they have. And what do they have, and what does that make clear, not only to themselves, but to us as we read the story? What do they have? 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what do they obviously see, and what do we obviously see? And if Jesus could come back down to earth, would certainly see, if he would open his eyes to reality, what should everybody see? It's not enough. The human resourcefulness will not pull this one off. Not with 5 loaves and 2 fish. This can't happen. And it's as if the apostles could be echoing the words of Moses from Numbers chapter 11, verse 13. Where am I to get bread to give to all this people? Shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them and be enough for them? Okay, that's Moses in the wilderness. Where are we going to get all this food? Where are we going to get all the fish? How are we going to feed all this people in the wilderness? And that connection should just scream at us right now what's going on, what Jesus is doing here. John?
What passage was that?
Numbers 11:13 and Numbers 11:32. And so Moses was kind of having a bit of trouble with it as well. Now, this extended conversation that develops, it may not seem all that long as Jesus and the apostles talk back and forth, but it's twice as long as the discussion in Matthew, Luke, or John. John's maybe second place, but it's about twice as long. And so often, especially in miracle stories, when one part of a story, whatever part of that story is different, it's calling attention to it. And here I think the dialogue, Mark is calling attention to the fact that Jesus is trying to get something across to the apostles. He's trying to teach them something in this back and forth, and they're not getting it. They're perplexed. They're confused. They respond somewhat disrespectfully, and this will lead Mark to a criticism that he records at the end of this episode. Mark says that the apostles did not understand what was going on because of the hardness of their heart. Mark 6:52. They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. We're not told all that may mean, just hardened to believe, hardened that they were blinded to see what Jesus was trying to get them to see, hardened in the nature of the kingdom that they were expecting. But it's a pretty strong statement that's made critically of the apostles as Jesus is talking and they're not getting. Jesus is doing something spectacular. Jesus is assembling Israel in the wilderness to give them rest and to feed them, just like God fed Israel in the wilderness. And he's saying to the apostles, guys, do you see what's going on here? Can you open your eyes? And obviously it's like, do you know who that makes me? If I'm doing this, do you know who that makes me out to be? And they're not seeing it. They're perplexed by it. And their hearts are hardened. And then in verses 39 and 40, this is interesting. He commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Green grass. That's one of those things that always gets pointed out when people talk about the Gospel of Mark, about these strange little details that get thrown in. Why green grass? Having a picnic. They certainly are. Any thoughts?
Where is there green grass? Is there green grass over there?
I think there's green grass. I think there's green grass right here on the hillside. So it must have been in the time of year there's been green grass, there's been rain, there's been green grass. A couple of thoughts, and this is just, it's like when you get in this mode of making these comparisons between what this is mirroring in the Old Testament, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One theme in the Old Testament is how God takes the barren wilderness and turns it into a pasture land and makes it beautiful. Another thing, and in fact, let me see, the kind of the transformation of the desert into a place of refreshment. And back in Ezekiel 34, when he talks about the shepherd, my servant David, who will make a covenant of peace so that the people can live safely in the wilderness. I won't go back here, but there in that same passage in Ezekiel 34, the prophet talks about there being green grass, that there are pastures, that the land is plentiful. Another thing, and I don't know, he commanded them to sit down in the green grass. He made them sit down in the green grass. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in the green pastures. I don't know. I'm just saying, once you get into this mode of making connections, it could very well be a variety of things going on. It could be a reference, because Ezekiel 34, where we already read about the shepherd and the wilderness, we read about that wilderness becoming green and plentiful. Mark points out the green grass. And then what about this sitting in 50s and hundreds? Can you think of any other time when someone talks about people in terms of hundreds and 50s and tens and things like that? What's that? A commander, perhaps? In the wilderness? Yeah, it could bring to mind the wilderness encampment. And in the wilderness encampment in Exodus chapter 18, we're told a couple of times, although this has to do sometimes with those who will be elders or who kind of be overseers of groups, that they have them grouped in hundreds and 50s and tens in the wilderness. And so it's just this plethora of detail in this little story that connects back to the wilderness in the days of Moses, and then because of all that connection is saying something so much greater than, oh yeah, Jesus fed the people. There's so much more going on than just the feeding of the people, as marvelous as marvelous as that is. When you put all of these things together that we've mentioned, Mark is painting a picture of Jesus as the Lord, as the servant of David, as the shepherd, calling the people of Israel together into the wilderness to rest and to give them food and sustenance. This is what he wants his apostles to see. This is what he invites the apostles to take part in and to participate in by helping to feed the people. And they are unable to see what's going on. And in verses 41 through the end, Jesus blesses the bread as would always have been done as the Jews prepared to eat. He recognizes the Lord as the giver of all food and provision. The way the miracle actually occurs, we're not told. We're not told when the food multiplies. We're not told how that happens. It's not important to Mark. We're just told that the outcome is certain, that they all ate and were satisfied. Leftovers are connected. What's your take on the significance of the amount of leftovers that are collected? No, it's probably a point that's been made many times. How much is collected? 12 baskets. What's our guess on that? Okay, you have the 12 tribes of Israel, and you have the 12 apostles. And it's almost as if these men who said, how in the world are we going to feed these people? At the end of the miracle, each of them has more, apparently, than any of them had when they began. And all the people have eaten and are satisfied, which is, of course, just a witness to the abundant provision that takes place in the miracle. And we're told that there are 5,000 men. At this point in time, the city of Capernaum and the city of Bethsaida have somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people in population. So you can imagine this is a big group of folks, 5,000 people. And excuse my grammar, but who is this miracle for? Or for whom was this miracle I can never say that for whom. Who's this miracle for? Is this, and let me just say, is the miracle, do you see the miracle being for the people or the miracle being for the apostles, and then why? What do you think? The apostles, and why particularly? Okay, because of their unbelief. John?
There's a way to read this story where the people don't even know that a miracle's taking place.
Yes. That's true. John says there's a way to read this story where the people don't even know a miracle's taken place. And I think the very fact that that is a possibility, I mean, Luke makes, there's no marveling by the people. Usually at the end of a miracle, what are the people saying? Whoa, who is this? How can he do this kind of? But there's nothing from the crowd. Now the crowd knows they've been fed, but they don't, and that's a pretty big deal, but the miracle does definitely seem to be for the 12, and that's, Jesus, of course, is trying to say something to them. John?
What you're getting at, but it does seem like after he sent the apostles out to preach and to perform miracles themselves, they come back to Jesus, and then they get two private miracles, if you read it that way. The first one being the feeding of the 5,000, and then walking on the water immediately after, which again was only something they got to witness.
That's right. I think it's a good point. I think that's how I would read it too, that this miracle is for them. And although the crowd may have wondered, it really is for the 12. Go ahead.
After both of these miracles were told in the heart of their heart.
Yes, exactly.
Almost like a conclusion to that little section.
Yes, absolutely. And so as we come to the end of this, we're asking the question, or it keeps coming up, who is Jesus? Jesus is the teacher, is the leader, is the Lord, is the shepherd who calls Israel together in the wilderness to give them rest, to feed them in the wilderness like God fed the children of Israel. And in that, if we had time, we'd go to all the feeding stories of the Old Testament. The feeding of Elijah, of Elisha, all of these miraculous feedings are by God. And so we're being told something here about the nature of Jesus, that he's the shepherd who leads the people who have no guidance, who are wandering. He is the prophet like Moses. He is the servant of David. He is the Lord God. I mean, essentially, we're being told in this miracle, the apostles were, had they had eyes to see it, that Jesus is the Lord God who feeds his people in the wilderness. And they did not see it. They didn't see it. This anticipates the Messianic banquet, of course, but that's just a whole other point to get to. And I want to mention briefly, because you know what, I really think, though we will not have ample time, I'd like for us to read what follows. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. There is a sudden rush to leave. Mark doesn't tell us what it is. If you want to know, you can go read the Gospel of John, but we're not going to do that and bring them together. But Jesus gets them out of there. Jesus gets the apostles on their way. He goes up, gets rid of the crowds, and then as the night unfolds, from where he's up on the mountain praying, he sees the apostles, which in and of itself is pretty much a miracle, isn't it? As they're struggling against a headwind, and Jesus decides to pass by them, we're told in the text. And he walks on the water to them, which of course, I suppose the most famous reference there about is Job 9:8, where we're told that God walks on the waves of the sea. But what's this miracle about? What's this miracle about? And especially as we are told that Jesus intended to pass by them. Any ideas or thoughts on that? It doesn't seem to be a rescue. They don't seem to be in danger. They're just tired. This isn't where they're going to die because of the storm. It's just windy. And when it says there that Jesus intended to pass by them, some may just think it means to walk, just to pass them by, which I think is probably not at all what the text is getting at. This verb is found 2 times in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 33, and when it's related to God, I should say. In Exodus chapter 33, God tells Moses that he will pass by him in the cleft of the rock. And in fact, in chapter 34, he does. In 1 Kings 19:11, 600 years or more after Moses, Elijah's on the same mountain Moses was on. He's depressed. He thinks he's the only guy left in Israel. And in 1 Kings 19:11, God tells Elijah that he will pass by him in the cleft, or in the mountain there at Mount Sinai. Pass by in relationship to God is a designation of an epiphany, or the appearance of deity, in order to strengthen and to encourage and to assure the people of God. God does these 2 times in the Old Testament, and Jesus is not, we're not being told that Jesus was just going to walk by him and they would go, hey, there he is. But he intended to pass by them. He intended to make a divine revelation of himself to them as the Lord God who walks on the waves of the sea. And I think this is essentially what he does. I think it's borne out by what Jesus says when they're afraid. Isn't it interesting that when he appears to them as God, they are afraid? And what does God typically say to people when he appears to them in the Old Testament and they're afraid? Something like, take heart, don't be afraid, which is exactly what Jesus says. And then, of course, depending how you look at the words in the text, Jesus can either be saying, it's me, or he can be saying, I am. I would tend to lean toward the I am. He says, ego, eimi, which is I am. It can be translated as, hey, it's me. But given the pass-by language, the way this language is used in the Old Testament, the significance of this moment, what appears to be happening here is that Jesus is making a divine manifestation of himself that is unmistakable to the apostles. And they're terrified. They think they've seen some sort of a water spirit or something, the word is. John?
Well, I just, sorry. I think this is really cool, just how Mark is doing this. And it seems to be he's going to make the same point later. It's this idea that the who is Jesus is being answered clearly, but the people, especially the disciples, aren't reaching that conclusion like they should. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely going to become a theme later. And I think as Mark goes on, their vision of him will become a little bit more clear at each passing verse until toward the end when I think it's finally revealed.
Yeah. Good point. And I think as we look at this, the end of this text, verse 52, they're astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Their only reaction is fear. It's not enlightenment. It's not a great and grand faith beyond anything they could have imagined Jesus to be. It's just on that emotional level of terror. That's all they're getting. And that's what they're getting because their hearts are hardened somehow to the truth. These 2 miracles are so clear, or are meant to be so clear. Now they get it on an intellectual level. Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus walked on the water. They get that. But they don't understand what that is saying or revealing to them about Jesus. And in this text, Moses and Elijah, I think, loom pretty large. Jesus is not a mere prophet. He's not a Moses. He's not an Elijah. In the wilderness, Moses was fed by God. In the wilderness, Elijah was fed by God. But Jesus feeds Israel in the wilderness. Moses stood in the mountain and the Lord passed by. Elijah stood on the mountain and the Lord passed by. Jesus is the Lord who passes by. Jesus could not be saying it any more clear than he is. He is the physical manifestation of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the one who feeds in the wilderness. He is the Lord who passes by. And it's an astounding text that answers this question, who is Jesus, on such a deep, penetrating level that is just missed by the 12 at that moment. Go ahead.
I think it's missed by a lot of scholars who will claim that Mark is less developed in his theology. They'll claim that Mark doesn't teach that Jesus is God, and that quote unquote, new belief came later with the Gospel of John or with other Gospels. I think it's very clear right here that Mark teaches the same thing, that he is God.
Yeah, you couldn't. It's hard to think of a more profound way to teach that, to make that claim than these 2 miracles. And when you consider them with their Old Testament background and what they mean. And there's so much here. There's so much. We're going to be leaving this text next week. I think John will be picking up from here, if I recall. There's so much for us to take. If you give me just 2 minutes to rattle something off for you to take with you tonight. Put yourself in the apostles' shoes, in a sense, where Jesus is saying to us, you give them something to eat. You face a world today. You're following me. I am the Lord God. I'm commissioning you to take what you've got and to serve the people of this world and to point them to me. And he sends us out as he compels these guys to get out into a situation that will bring a storm upon them. But he does so knowing that he will reveal himself to them and that he will be there to care for them even as they face that storm and the difficulty of that moment. And anyway, if you'll think about this, meditate on it, and reflect on it, I think you'll find it to be just one of the most amazing teachings about the identity of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Mark.